So, thank you for being here. Could you please introduce yourself, including your name, job, area of expertise, and role in the event?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I think it was a nice conference, and it's nice that we can have a short flashback on what happened and what was discussed. My name is Tiit, Tiit Oidjärv. For years, I've been working in the spatial planning and land use planning field. For the last 7 years, I worked at the ministry level, working with spatial planning policy, but also with some national land use plans and spatial plans, and also with digitalization. So in the field, so it's quite a wide spectrum. And also previously, I worked in the private sector with environmental impact assessment and social impact assessment of certain plans and strategies as well. And in the conference that we're discussing, I had the privilege of presenting, in addition to listening. And what I actually presented was results of a study I recently made during my studies at the Gothenburg University on the links between land use planning and environmental goals. So I think it fitted well in the conference. It was quite a diverse conference, covering a wide range of issues from just transition to environmental goals to SDGs. So it was a nice mix, I think.
Could you tell us about some Estonian structural and social consequences of European decarbonization efforts?
Yes, thank you. There was actually a presentation by a former colleague of mine at the Ministry of Finance, who's responsible for these issues in Estonia and managing a lot of it. So I do suggest, if you have the time, to also look at some of the presentations, which were quite interesting. So Estonia has ratified the Paris Agreement. We have accepted also the 2050 EU climate goals, and we are committed to reducing our greenhouse gases by 80% in relation to the early 90s. But there are, of course, some challenges in relation to this. When we look at Estonia, the geographical area that might be affected the most is Ida-Virumaa. It's an area in the northeast corner of Estonia bordering Russia. And it is actually a region that has already slightly lower socioeconomic status. Let's say there are somewhat higher unemployment, somewhat lower wages, and so it is an area that is highly reliant on quite energy consuming industry and also energy production. So I think that is the region that will be impacted the most, and that is actually where most of our just transition funds are planning on being used, because that is the most sensitive area in this relation. And why is this area so specific or significant? It's basically due to oil shale, because Estonian energy production has for decades relied largely on oil shale. If you don't happen to know, it's a certain sedimentary rock. You can find it in many places, but not many countries have used it as we have in Estonia. There have been like ups and downs using this oil shale, but in Estonia we have used it for energy production, as I said, for decades, since I think post World War II. I think it's in high use, and actually Estonia has been the only country that has relied on oil shale in most part in its energy production. During the last couple of years, the overall excavation numbers of oil shale have actually declined. So we are using less of it. And also the share of energy produced by oil shale is also in decline, being replaced by renewable energy produced inside Estonia, but also in other countries, because the policy is to better connect Estonia to our Western neighboring countries, and using thereby both Finnish nuclear energy, but also Norwegian renewable energy a lot. So this has meant that since it is cheaper and less environmentally burdening to use energy that is produced by other means, then oil shale has gone down in energy production. But that doesn't mean that the problems are less important. So there are social issues related to this, and that's what we have to work on.
What are some current economic restructuring efforts in Estonia and the Baltic Sea region in response to environmental and sustainable development? For example, the Green Deal and decarbonization.
I think Estonia is not very different from other countries. We have also our national energy and climate plan, just like the other European countries, that goes through basically most of the things that we can focus on, like energy efficiency and decarbonization in various sectors, energy production, transportation, and so on, and also innovation. As all countries, we have our challenges. There's, as I said, the energy sector is quite reliant on oil shale still. It is decreasing, and we have new wind parks and solar panels put up, but the speed of this is not what we would like it to be. So there's quite a number of things going on. And I think also what we have, there are areas that we have not focused on yet, at least in Estonia. For instance, the sector that I've been mostly involved in, the sector of land use and land use planning. So there's a lot we can do in land use as well. We can find places to put up new wind parks. We can design our cities and settlement structure so that we shouldn't travel so much. And there's also other means. There's walkable cities and other initiatives. So I think there's a lot more that we can do and we have to do. It seems to me personally that there's some pre-assumptions that we need to reassess while doing this. For instance, the idea of the Green Deal seems to be that all actions or all activities, economic activities and other activities, should be focused on environmental issues and climate targets alone. That is quite a significant change, at least when I look at this from the spatial planning discourse. In my mind, and I think also in practice in many countries, the idea of spatial planning, for instance, has been to balance the needs of various sectors and various needs and various stakeholders. So there's no predefined goals normally in a spatial planning process. But it might be that if we live in this new era that has environmental goals set as the highest, we might need to reassess some of our practices and redesign them to fully contribute to these other goals or the environmental and climate related goals. And this is definitely, if that is true, I'm not totally claiming this to be true, but if it is true, it is significant change we need to take in our minds and in our practices. And it will definitely take time and a lot of debating as well. But I guess it is necessary to reach the targets that we have taken.
And you are an expert in land use planning, having done a lot of studies and work in it. How can land use planning help achieve environmental goals? And do you have any specific examples from Estonia?
Yes, that's true. I'm very much into land use planning, and that's something I've been working with for a lot of time. There's many legacies, as in many sectors. There's also legacies in land use planning, be it the transition that we have seen in Estonia, going from a Soviet system and co-ownership system to a market economy and private ownership. Public and private cooperation, I think, is something that can be definitely approved. So I think a lot of these legacies, they reflect in the practice of land use planning as well. That's also why I think it's quite challenging to actually try to change a lot of these practices. But when we look at land use planning, I do believe that there's a lot that you can do when making land use planning decisions or spatial planning decisions. As I did a study on this, then I did find a huge number of environmental goals and targets that you can contribute to with good land use planning decisions. For instance, reducing soil cover or trying to fully utilize existing infrastructure. There's actually, I think, a lot you can do. What I've also been looking at is how to support this, and at least from my findings from the study I conducted, it's the factors that are closest to planners that seem to support accounting for environmental goals more. For instance, clearly set environmental goals on the municipality level, benchmarking activities between local municipalities, good examples of how this has been done. And when looking at the actual local level planning decisions, the higher tier contributions seem to be of less importance, which I do find quite significant. So if some country has clearly defined climate targets or environmental targets or goals on the national level, this seems to be of less importance, at least based on my findings, than the local level. Of course, land use planning is an essentially local activity, so it's probably understandable that this is true, that local level commitment is the most important thing. I personally, in my study, I looked at Finnish and Estonian land use planners working in municipalities and also in the private sector as planning consultants. Municipalities can be quite small, so it's hard to give basically sufficient workload to the planner. The capacity issue is definitely something that needs attention. In some countries, there's a pool of local municipality bureaucrats that can be shared between municipalities. This is the practice in the Netherlands, if I understood correctly. This seems to be a nice way how to deal with the capacity issue. We have tried actually similar instruments in Estonia as well, but so far we have not succeeded that well.
During the conference, there are presentations and case studies presenting different regions and research projects. Could you tell us more about the conclusions and insights taken from this conference?
I think for me, when looking back, two presentations stood out in particular. One was a presentation in the session where I also participated myself as a presenter. It was a Swedish colleague from their Boverket, which is the authority dealing with land use planning issues on the national level. And what I found quite interesting is how important the national level seems to be in their case in reaching environmental goals, also in land use planning. So I know that the northern countries in particular have stressed the importance of the local municipality in contributing to national goals and in their roles, but them bringing in the national level as well is certainly something I also understand the importance of, but I think for me it shows that environmental goals and sustainable development goals is something that needs a multi-level contribution, and it cannot be solved by one governance level alone. So I think that was a nice presentation from the Swedish colleagues. And perhaps another one I would like to highlight is, it was quite towards the end of the conference. It was a presentation of the ESPON Escape project given by Andrew Kopus. The presentation and the project focused a lot on shrinking areas and trying also to create a link to these transition and environmental goals issues. Shrinking populations is something that I've been also working on in Estonia. Together with the OECD, there's an ongoing project on Estonia on how to manage these shrinking regions better, both rural and also peripheral urban areas that also are shrinking in many countries across Europe. I think there actually is, the issue is the same across the OECD countries. There are shrinking regions everywhere, so basically everybody has to deal with it. But the presentation and the overview of the ESCAPE project was highlighted the importance of understanding the patterns or the reasons behind shrinking. So if we try to create national level interventions, funding schemes, or perhaps even differentiated service provision rules or so on, it is necessary to understand whether these overall frameworks fit the certain location, because each location has its story, why it is shrinking, what's the mechanism behind that. It might be an industrial transition from one sector to another, it might be migratory processes, it might be different things. And to understand which instrument should be attributed, I think was the key takeaway from me from that presentation. Our overcity project should be ending early next year, so I'm really hoping that these two projects can be combined into policy frameworks in Estonia as well.
And what is your own opinion on these findings, and what could be expanded on?
It was a diverse conference, and there's many takeaways. The issue of reaching sustainable development goals or environmental goals, it's tackled from quite many diverse angles, and it's understandable as the issue is quite critical and it needs to be addressed from many policy levels and also levels of governance. There was also, for instance, another presentation also in our session by the Latvian colleague, I think, who presented her framework on how to compare basically countries by their contribution to various goals and their activities, which was a quite significant model of how to do calculations. So it's everybody trying to somehow contribute to this one goal, and I think we need all these contributions. We need the contribution of the land use sector, of the energy sector, and their transitions. So reaching sustainable development goals and environmental goals cannot be solved by one sector alone.
And for those that are interested, where can we find out more?
The last time I checked, all the presentations are available on the ESPON website in relation to this conference. If you're more interested in what is going on in Estonia, then I suggest you look at the Ministry of Finance web pages. There's a section on the transition, the just transition process in Estonia, that also has further links in relation to our Ida-Viru area. And of course, having a second look at the Green Deal and the European Commission communications is always a good thing.